who's speaking. I want to welcome also many Jackson Center interns of various kinds, interns from high school programs, high school teachers, interns from Allegheny College, from the local law firm Philip Lytle, who are joining us from some of these sessions. So welcome, young people. We're really glad to have you. I want to also thank Greg Peterson and his staff, Greg Peterson and Jim Johnson and their staff at the Jackson Center for their many contributions to this week. If you've not picked up literature on the Jackson Center, there's some at the back, but also the website has all sorts of really interesting YouTubes and videos and other things that Greg has gathered over nearly 15 years on Jackson's legacy. If you want to find the 400 minutes of English at the Nuremberg trials, you only have to look at the Jackson Center and find all of the information that was available in movies at that time. So I strongly recommend that you make a point of reading the Jackson Center's materials as they appear. They're being added to every year. Our speaker today needs no Chautauqua introduction. His name is John Q. Barrett. Greg Peterson and John Barrett really got the Jackson Center around the year 2000. They deserve great thanks from the area, from the community, and from a group of historians that use the Jackson Center for its many programs for their strong efforts that are continuing. John is a professor at St. John's University, professor of law at St. John's University, and Jackson is his area of research expertise. His collection of Jackson's notes on Roosevelt called That Man is available in the back for purchase. I suspect it's also at the Chautauqua bookstore. And he is the Jackson biographer par excellence. If you want to know who gave Jackson his first haircut, ask John. It's that level of intense interest in Robert H. Jackson, born Spring Creek, Pennsylvania, Frewsburg High School graduate, and Jamestown High School graduate around 1910. So John's going to talk today about communication. When we put this program together this year, all of us have been remarking and visualizing the differences between communication in 1950 and communication in 2013. The growth of the web, the growth of the information revolution has changed how we get information. But some of our former colleagues passed that information on very well through their writings and through their public speaking and through their contributions that were public through their own personalities. And that information is something we thought we would focus on today. So today John will be speaking tomorrow. I'll be speaking on Wednesday. Larry Thompson, who is the General Counsel of PepsiCo. On Thursday, Peter Weitzel, Peter's here someplace, to the former Miami Herald. And on Friday, the president of Allegheny College, Jim Mullen, will be part of this series. So we'll commend the series to you. Come every day if you can. John will talk about Jackson's communication and Jackson's communication. John?
Doug, thank you very much. Thank you to Chautauqua and the Department of Education. Teresa Adams and her colleagues, they're our hosts, and put this together annually, and it's a wonderful thing to be part of. And thanks also to my Jackson Center colleagues, principally Doug, Jim Johnson, everyone else who is part of this ongoing labor, not really just of love, although that's a part of it, a labor of merit. Doug over generously gave me equal credit with Greg for getting the Jackson Center off the ground. But in fact, I was part of the bigger Jackson thing. In other words, the out there in the world Jackson thing, which was already big at the turn of this century, but frankly has become enormous. This is one of the world's biggest lives. This is one of the world's most revered names in law and diplomacy and history circles. This is a life, a writer, a communicator, a legacy that just continues to ascend. The serendipity was, as I was coming of age, if you will, and getting it and working on it, I connected with Greg Peterson as this region, Jackson's ancestral region, was getting it and enhancing it. And so it's really been a sort of two-track combination process from then through now, and I think perpetually. Thanks to each of you, obviously, for your Chautauquan interest in learning and merit subjects and communication. And, of course, thanks to Robert Jackson, a Chautauquan, dead over 50 years, but, you know, great material. Without great material, communication isn't meritorious communication. It's also great to be here with most of my family, and always fun to be back at Chautauqua. It occurred to me, as I was preparing for this, kind of late in the game, what this event actually is. Many of you have spent much time at Chautauqua, and so you know about 1045 lectures and other venues and other programs. One of the extraordinary things that Chautauqua offers is master's classes. The chance for artists in various disciplines to work with a premier performer, teacher, artist in that discipline. To see him or her do the craft, and then, frankly, to take a deep breath and do it for his or her supervision and commentary. Now, I'm not the master. He's the master. This is a master's class in communication. And frankly, what Robert Jackson's life and legacy is lots of technical, particular things in law and history, but bigger and more important than all of that, communication. That's why he's one of the top X lives of the 20th century and will continue to grow in importance. And so, by proxy, I guess, this is day one of me offering his master's class, and really the Jackson Center is a master's center in communication. How do you know of Robert Jackson? Let me just do a little quick audience survey. You're allowed to shout out at this point in the class, but if I say Jackson, the word association thing you know about him is what? Okay, that's one. Supreme Court, that's two. Okay, wonderful. You've set up my slides. I had them in the other order. Maybe this is working upwards. You think Robert Jackson in the context of the U.S. Supreme Court. He served for 13 years, 1941 to 1954. He was AWOL for 1 year, 1945-1946, when he was the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at Nuremberg. He left a written body of Supreme Court opinions that just sing. He's generally regarded as the best writer ever to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. When Chief Justice John Roberts was in Jamestown speaking at the Robert H. Jackson Center in May, he referred to Jackson's vibrant, live legacy for all of today's justices in the form of the opinions he wrote and the model he set of judging. It first struck me as a student reading Supreme Court opinions, which I like. I mean, I'm a law professor, I'm a lawyer, but they can get a little dry. And then all of a sudden you sort of turn the page and you hit a Jackson opinion, and I'm not alone in this. People say, wow, this is different. This is better. And I think part of what's going on is a kind of candor, pragmatism, approachability, common sense, case at a time judging, conversation with this person who's communicating with you. That was his art in his Supreme Court writing. That's one association point, memory point. The other, of course, is this podium in Nuremberg in 1945-1946, where he served as the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at the world's first international criminal court, the trial of the 22 principal surviving Nazi war criminals. And Jackson there, in his opening statement, November 1945, his closing statement, July 1946, his full-day argument, underappreciated about the criminality of Nazi organizations, February 1946, and about a dozen witness examinations that he did over the course of the trial, was at that podium communicating, of course, the power of Allied occupation and the commitment to hold these perpetrators responsible, but the principled legal basis on which that proceeding was going forward. It was controversial at its time. In some respects, it's probably still controversial in our time, but it's the kind of event that had never been done before, was a novel undertaking, could have gone wrong in a million ways, and generally didn't. Generally succeeded, generally was fair, generally held individuals responsible, generally made possible Germany's future as a liberal, human rights respecting democratic republic, and generally built the historical record that has allowed succeeding generations to understand Nazi criminality, the Holocaust, etc., etc. And he was the principal architect of that undertaking. We think of Nuremberg from the back end, from history. It's a communicative success story. But on a day-to-day basis, it was harrowing improvisation, but he got it done. Those both, Supreme Court decision-making and Nuremberg, are weighty topics of both written and spoken communicative form. They're both based in careful composition. Sure, there are extemporaneous moments, there's winging it, there's behind-the-scenes, heated, back-and-forth communication, but bringing it to its most formal public forms was really quite careful craftsmanship in Nuremberg as it was on the Supreme Court. And all of it is based in relevant background. Communication doesn't just happen in the air, or we call it BSing, I think. Real communication happens based on knowing something, having reflected on it, having pulled together your perspective on it, having summoned the courage to air it, having found the people with whom to engage about it, and then, frankly, listening and having the other half of the communicative dialogue that allows the process to continue onward and upward. Robert Jackson, in these two big spots and across his life, is great, was great, because he was a great communicator. This is true of his life in the private realm. This is true when his life moved into public realms that were not yet widely known. And it was true when he became a national and then international famous leading figure. And I want to show you, this is a presentation that has a fair amount of visuals, so my students in the back rows, if you wish to creep forward, that'll be fine. I want to show you a few images of Jackson performing his craft. This is 1935. This is a young New Deal lawyer arguing for tax reform and a really dramatic reform of the federal income tax to make it much more progressive and frankly to ask much more of the citizens with means at a time of growing national response to national problems, which requires revenue. That's Jackson in a public setting in 1936 giving a political speech. The big old microphones are clunky things. You know, I'm wearing a little clip lavalier. But they also have a kind of stately majesty, and I love the old photos of him with the microphones. That's Jackson seated at his desk in his Nuremberg office, surrounded by his principal colleagues, Colonel John Amon, Colonel Robert Story, General Wild Bill Donovan, and Jackson's own son, William Jackson, giving a press conference. Because, of course, he had the podium moments and the courtroom moments, but he also did a lot of public communication and public diplomacy before, during, throughout the trial process, because the world was watching and struggling to understand. That's another press conference. This one maybe is an inside joke that only amuses me. This is his British colleague, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, and look at the expression on his face. And look at the expression on Jackson's face. Because this was a press conference in Nuremberg that was taken over by their French colleagues and conducted in French. And the two of them spoke, respectively, Zero and Pidgin French. And they had to sit through this press conference that lasted 90 minutes. And Jackson wrote an irritated letter about that evening to his wife. Communication, right? Reaching your audience. That's Jackson on the tarmac outside of Nuremberg at the military air base in Fürth. Again, another microphone stand. Newsreels, radio, etc. The ears and the eyes of the world were upon him throughout that process. That's Jackson at, anybody know? There's a geographic tilt against knowing where this is. Stanford University, very good. That's the Hoover Institution Tower. That's Jackson in 1950, the principal speaker dedicating what was then the new and is now the old Stanford Law School building. And this is one of the dozens and dozens of goofy, maybe, photos of Jackson addressing local American domestic association meetings. This happens to be the Independent Telephone Operators of New York State Conference in 1948, held in Jamestown. And he was such a sort of local grounded guy and a former lawyer for the telephone company that when someone put the arm on him and said, "Would you come and speak about telecommunications law and technology and its developments. And he said, really? Me? He then sort of buckled down and did homework and wrote a passably relevant speech and came to Jamestown and delivered it to those folks with quite a charming smile. That's Jackson, obviously, at a commencement. I think that's Dartmouth when he was awarded an honorary degree there in the late 1940s. You see the ABC radio, and we'll come back to this, but Jackson was a voice on national radio virtually every week for virtually a decade. It's hard material to extract from archives. That's an ongoing process, but it's there, and it's a majestic collection of performances in communication. Now, I want to talk to you about two principal things. I want to talk about Jackson's life path, how he became the guy who did this, and communication that was part of it along the way. And I want to speak to you about the influences, if you will, the life path, and in it, the forces that made him the communicator. So first, the life path. That's where it began. That's the Broken Straw Creek in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania. That photo was taken in the 20th century. Jackson was born in that family farmhouse in 1892. Sadly, it's no longer standing, but the Broken Straw is still a beautiful, pristine, burbling little river. And in the weeds and tall grasses up on that knoll, which the floods have never reached, Jackson's ancestors picked a proper elevation and a good spot, you find the foundation of the house, and old metal doorknobs and so forth. He was a fourth generation of early settlers in Pennsylvania. His great-grandfather was the first white settler in this valley in Warren County, in Spring Creek Township. He'd actually got out to the Ohio territories, and Indian wars had driven him back. And he and a mate had picked this place and cleared a small plot and built a log cabin, and then cleared land, and then started to farm, and in time had a son, and the next generation was Jackson, born in 1892. That's downtown Spring Creek. You want to talk about humble beginnings, that and that are pretty strong contenders. You can see the traffic in downtown Spring Creek. There's one horse-drawn buggy. This hill is called Eldred Hill. This is on the north end of town. Jackson's grandmother was an Eldred, and off-screen, but sort of where the picture is taken from, is Jackson Hill, and the farm is down in this direction. He was a farm boy of multiple generations. They were literate, but not educated formally. They had books, but not a vast collection. They were interested in life and public affairs, but not in a sophisticated, participatory way. That's where he came from. Think Abraham Lincoln, born 1809, plus 85 years. Jackson, born 1892. The parallels in beginning in primitive situations and ending up in exalted destinations are quite striking. That's Jackson graduating from the Frewsburg High School in 1909. He went to a school there above the New York State line where his family moved from the first grade through his senior year of high school. It was a small school. It had a few elementary classrooms on the ground floor. It had a high school in a general room on the second floor. He was the best student, but it was a small class. I'm not sure the competition was very stiff. His teachers were devoted, but not particularly highly educated. There were some Regents courses, but not really a full Regents curriculum being offered in the Frewsburg High School. And that's the end of his general higher education. That's where he sort of concludes the typical ladder. He doesn't then go on to a college or a university. Instead, he moves across the Frewsburg border and north up into Jamestown, the community at the south end of the lake, and enrolls as a graduate student, if you will, at the Jamestown High School, a second senior year of high school in 1909, 1910, when he was 17, turning 18. You see there, it was a bigger city, and there were more educational resources, and we'll come back to this, but it turns out that there were some teachers who were particularly devoted in shaping the skills that make Jackson the communicator he is. And then he apprentices for local lawyers, and then he becomes a young lawyer. And by the 1920s, this is 1924, a little fuller of face, a little fancier of attire, he's a prospering Western New York lawyer. That's his profession, that's his milieu, that's his framework for his energies and his learning. Had to put this one in at Chautauqua Institution. That's his boat, and that's Chautauqua Lake. By the late 1920s, Jackson had this boat. If you look at the transom very closely, you see it's called the Alibi. It was the place he went to when he snuck out of the office. This is Jackson and his son and various friends about to head out or about to tie up after a cruise. They dressed well when they boated in the 1920s. And this place formed him literally from the water and the ground up. He moved on to bigger boats from the Alibi. He went to the New Deal. He went to Washington because he was an old friend, colleague, supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. And by 1935, 1936, 1937, when Roosevelt would go on fishing trips, again, very well dressed for fishing trips, in the waters off of Florida, and bring selected people, it included an Assistant Attorney General, Robert Jackson, the Secretary of Interior, Harold Lakes, and of course the President. You'd never guess how important that hand gripping that railing was for the effect of this photograph. It looks so relaxed. But of course, this man could not have stood without that grip. And Jackson learned a lot at many levels from this person who, of course, was the great formative mentor and influencing his political life. Pretty soon, Jackson was this kind of figure, cover of Newsweek magazine, prominent national name, prominent trial lawyer, prominent Supreme Court advocate, etc. And pretty soon, this kind of thing was happening. This is 1938. The history that we end up with is, of course, deeply fascinating, but sometimes, even if it's a parlor game, it's a little entertaining to think about the what-ifs, if the path had taken another form. You see, Franklin Roosevelt, I think sincerely, in 1938, intended to observe the two-term tradition, to retire to Hyde Park, New York, something like Jefferson at Monticello. He'd signed a contract to write a column for a national magazine. He had broken ground and begun to build the first presidential library. And of course, maneuvering to be Roosevelt's successor within the Democratic Party was an active enterprise. By every account, Roosevelt's preferred next generation was Jackson. And beginning in this time period, 1938, Roosevelt tries to orchestrate an anointing and elevating of Jackson that would position Jackson to be the party's nominee in 1940 and, they hoped, elected. Very quickly, in 1938, the effort to run Jackson for governor of New York gets complicated, and instead Roosevelt nominates him to be the Solicitor General of the United States. He ends up at this desk after an incredibly fierce confirmation battlefront. And when you read those hearings, you see the stakes are really explicit discussion from Republicans and conservative Democrats that the time to stop Jackson is here in this confirmation hearing, because otherwise, dadgummit, he's going to be president of the United States. That's 1938. He begins to argue before this entity, the Supreme Court of the United States. He'd already argued before it for many years, but in high volume as Solicitor General, he's appearing before the court. This is the court that was still Chief Justice Hughes and Brandeis and Cardozo and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the anti-New Deal court, but beginning to turn. Justice Hugo Black, the first Roosevelt appointee, was the summer of 1937. And Jackson argues before that court almost 50 times in the ensuing 2 years, and wins, some are re-arguments, it's a little complicated to count, wins about 45 of those arguments. Not a hostile court, a semi-hostile court becoming a friendly court, but being pushed, frankly, by the excellence of Jackson's litigation efforts. And then in 1940, he gets appointed up from Solicitor General to be the Attorney General of the United States. This is the Attorney General's conference room. Eric Holder today on this wall, which is the windows overlooking Constitution Avenue, has personally selected portraits of two Attorneys General to hang there, Robert F. Kennedy and Robert H. Jackson. Jackson found this whole conference room too cavernous and enormous. So if you look closely, you see that that's a desk. He gave it to his secretary as her office, and he used the secretary's office as his workspace. We'll come back to workspace, the solitary, sweat-raking endeavor of creativity. Jackson worked alone, worked well and doggedly, and didn't need a lot of space. He needed a pen and a pad, and his brain, and time. And so, who needs this? That can be a secretary's office. In 1940, this stuff was back. Roosevelt's choice for president is Bob Jackson. And Jackson, as Attorney General, is in a not subtle way also really running for president. He's being featured and speaking widely around the country, January, February, March, into April of 1940. And of course, Adolf Hitler is also up to things as spring of 1940 develops, and the situation changes. Jackson, somewhat charmingly, resisted all of this stuff. Yes, he did the speaking, and yes, he was flattered at the ego level to be featured in this way. But he also was the point man in a lot of his public speaking for Roosevelt. Third-termer Robert Jackson and anti-third-termer Wendell Willkie, who ends up being the Republican nominee. Jackson, by design, but also by belief, was arguing publicly, tradition, schmedition. What this country has is what it needs. The framers gave us a constitution that doesn't put a term limit on our presidents in those periods. Later amended, of course. And the next president should be this president, Franklin Roosevelt. That's Jackson's argument in 1940, and eventually, of course, that's what happens. And so then Jackson, in 1941, moves on to this job. He's now the junior justice on the Supreme Court in the upper right-hand corner. And he serves on the Supreme Court, as I said, for the next 13 years, with an interlude, thanks to this fellow. In the spring of 1945, he gets stuck with a job that he didn't want and never sought and was deeply unprepared for, and gets a list of things he should know about from Roosevelt's inside principal advisors, Secretary of War Stimson, White House counsel Sam Rosenman. Number one on that list, out at Alamogordo, a bunch of scientists are working on a weapon which could end the war. Somewhere near that point on the list, we've committed to try Hitler in an international trial as soon as he's defeated and captured. And of course, we need to kind of gear that up and get a lawyer. So Harry Truman reaches for the best, by consensus, well-known national figure in the country with a law degree, Robert H. Jackson. He asks Jackson in late April 1945 to take on this task. Truman doesn't really know better, but here's what he says. The Supreme Court takes a summer recess. I hear you're a fast writer. I bet you're already done with your opinions for the term. We have an agreement with the Allies. We have a plan on how to do it. We have the evidence all assembled. We're within hours of capturing Hitler. You can do this during your summer recess and be back on the Supreme Court on the first Monday of October 1945. Jackson, at lots of levels, responds affirmatively. Your president asks. The right answer is yes. Anyone says you're the one person on earth who could do a job, you're flattered and you probably say yes. And you're sold a bill of goods that it's a little tap-in putt. Okay. Well, it was not a little tap-in putt. Jackson spent the summer of 1945 doing high-end diplomacy in London with a French and a British, and off-screen a Russian counterpart, creating the International Military Tribunal, the first international criminal court. This had not been worked out at Yalta or any place else, except in a very general headline way. And so Jackson has to do this diplomatic work. You might say, well, I'm sure the State Department helped, or the White House helped, or the War Department helped. In fact, every time Jackson asked for help, Truman and others basically said, oh, just do what you think is right. It's sort of tossing him the keys to be the United States at a time when that includes the options to maintain alliance with the Soviets or take a different path. A dauntingly huge moment of discretion, and they reach the London Agreement in August and create the International Military Tribunal. They pick a location, they refurbish the courthouse, they go to Nuremberg, the 4 national Allied flags hang there, and by November, Jackson is at the podium opening the Nuremberg trial. This is the courtroom from the air, defendants, judges, judicial assistants, defense attorney, VIP guests, press corps, and prosecutor tables. French, Russian, American, British, and these are sort of extra seats. Some judge, some prosecutor personnel sit there. And this distinctively cross-legged posture is Jackson, front and center. That's Jackson at the podium. That's Jackson famously cross-examining Hermann Goering a very tough and complicated endeavor during that trial process. And that's the rest of Jackson's life. After that AWOL year is done, he comes back to the Supreme Court. It wasn't quite as jolly a place as this picture makes it appear, although it wasn't quite a terrible divided place either, as some have portrayed. This is Chief Justice Vinson, now Justice Black, who you saw as the junior justice in 1937, is the senior associate justice. And you see Jackson has moved a little bit, but not really very much, frankly, in seniority, from the rookie justice to justice number 6. He continues to write the distinctive opinions and builds the body of Supreme Court work that is his legacy in that realm. That's the path. Through all of that, what Jackson is doing is composing and speaking. And I want to just sort of tick off across that chronology, dimensions of that. 1905 to 1910, he's a student. He's a student listener here at Chautauqua, Jamestown. He hears William Jennings Bryan give the Cross of Gold speech. He is engaged in fraternal organizations and early speaking in Democratic Party, county committee, etc. kinds of things. He's involved in school oratory and debate. 1912 to 1917, young Jackson, a lawyer, is a speaker and a communicator in courtrooms, local justice courts in Jamestown and rural surrounding areas, Mayville, the county seat at the top end of the lake. He's recruited to Buffalo, the 10th largest city in the country. He works in the world's largest office building when he's litigating in Buffalo and begins the network of big, high-end legal profession contacts that are part of the rest of his life and part of his legacy. By the way, the new United States Federal District Courthouse in Buffalo, on the circle at the heart of downtown next to the McKinley Obelisk, is by legislation that the President signed last fall, the Robert H. Jackson United States Courthouse. And the official naming moment ceremony will be on August 22 of this year. So if you're in the neighborhood and you want a little side trip up from Chautauqua, Buffalo, Jackson Courthouse, ribbon cutting, August 22. 1918 to 1933, Jackson returns to Jamestown. This is his base of practice, but through bar associations, through practice areas like oil and gas, he quickly rises to be a national figure in the legal profession. Meeting and speaking and writing and composing and communicating, rising to be the head of the American Bar Association House of Delegates in 1933. He's also very involved in fraternal organizations, which in those days are speaking and idea meetings. There was also a little beer and other spirits involved, but serious intellectual gatherings, the Eagles, the Elks, you kind of name a club, Jackson was a part of those organizations. He also is involved in politics during that time period. The passion of his youth, which had sort of cooled as his practice advanced, revives in the form of supporting Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt for governor in 28, for re-election in 1930, for president in 1932. Robert Jackson is nationally a very active proxy speaker for FDR. And of course, that's part of what results in his recruitment to Washington. 1934 to 1935, Jackson, in his first presidential appointment, heads the Revenue Bureau in the Department of the Treasury and is testifying prominently, including in favor of that revenue bill that I showed you a picture of. He's also litigating prominently. He's the chief prosecutor of Andrew W. Mellon in Pittsburgh in 1935. And he's recruited from Treasury to the SEC and then to the Justice Department and starts to argue Supreme Court cases and starts to testify virtually every month on whatever the legislative battle of the moment is. His path towards politics is connected to FDR's, but also his own. Jackson being boomed for governor of New York or for the New York Court of Appeals is a fact of 1934, 1936, 1938. In the end, paths he never pursues, but all paths involving substantive ideas and communication. 1937, big year. He's not yet the Solicitor General, but he is the administration's #2 witness behind the Attorney General himself, defending Roosevelt's court packing plan. Not that Jackson was part of the sponsorship of this or thought it was a good idea. This was a limb that Franklin Roosevelt went out on all by himself, or at least with others. But Jackson persuaded the president to start telling the truth about it. It's not about helping aged justices catch up on their backlog. It's about reining in a runaway court that's doing politics in the name of constitutional law. It's about a kind of conservative, honest reading of the Constitution. It's about judicial restraint and deferring to the elected branches that the people have elected, and they have enacted Social Security and the Wagner Act, et cetera, et cetera. And by the end of that year, on top of that court-packing advocacy, which almost saves the bill, Jackson begins to give very controversial direct speeches, planned really one-on-one with Roosevelt, that are about the New Deal program going forward. The battle against big business and its desire to impose excessive austerity that's causing the recessionary return of 1937-38. Sound familiar? Is the speech making that Jackson does. He is the point person of that effort, which is 1938 and forward. And 1938, of course, is a campaign year. Jackson, as I said briefly, is boomed for governor and debates Wendell Willkie, but then retreats, if you will, and is appointed Solicitor General. Has to communicate and has to win that battle for his own career. And then as Solicitor General begins to argue those 40 and more cases before the Supreme Court as it's turning. He's also on national radio every month, most weeks, speaking about political, legal, etc. topics. 1940, he becomes Attorney General, and as I said, his speaking picks up even more. The presidential campaign, his own / Roosevelt's, and then 1941, a different form of communicating. Supreme Court opinions is his milieu, his approach to message making. 1945, 1946, Nuremberg, including, by the way, a written document at the front end, his report to Harry Truman about how I'm going to do this, which is a brilliant document. I'll come back to that when I close, and the trial work that I've described. And 1947 to 1954, the rest of his life, Supreme Court opinions, plus extrajudicial speaking and writing, largely devoted to the topic of Nuremberg. Probably shortened his life. He worked so hard and traveled so far and kind of burned the candle at many ends, but felt drawn to engage in substance as a communicator. So that's who he was. How did he do it is the topic I want to turn to now. How did he actually become this phenom, this super talented communicator and life in our history? Of course, part of it is nature. And, he was what he was, he had what he had, and that's the baseline. But on top of that, there are many ingredients. Let's start with that house, which you've seen previously, and now his parents. Hardworking farm couple at the end of the 19th century, married 9 years before they had this baby. He was a bit of a surprise. They thought they weren't able to have children. And you see the hired man and some of the animals and the bachelor great-uncle who lived with them. He ended up being childcare when young Jackson showed up on the scene and taught Jackson how to ride and taught him which plants to eat and which ones were poisonous, etc. That's Mom, Dad, and Robert. 1893, I figure. That's about a 1-year-old posing in a photo studio. These parents, I'm a parent, she's my kid, a lot of you are parents, they deserve some credit. They were rural, simple people, become early 20th century, local entrepreneurs, at least Jackson's father. The places he ended up were unimaginable to them, except, his mother did live on at least till 1940. She got to see him be Attorney General of the United States. She never gave interviews, except once a reporter got her to give a quote. What was Robert like as a boy? And she told somebody from the Washington Star, he never made me no trouble. You never made me trouble. Well, we'll come back to that. I think it does say something both about the sort of love and support, but the limits of the launch that these parents could provide. That's the class photo at the Frewsburg School. He's the little nipper on the right. That's a little blow-up of his face. It's probably 3rd, 4th grade. You get a sense of the early 20th century simplicity, Little House on the Prairie-ish almost quality of this school. That's his educational environment. That's the Jamestown High School, the place he was drawn to for that graduate school year, 1909, 1910. A bigger place. But a building is not the point. That's just a structure. It's the internal stimulus that he got there. This one's particularly dear to my heart. Do you know what it is? Some of you were engaged in this in your youth. That is a high school debate team. There he is. Nice kind of pompadour hairstyle, 1910, 1911. I believe that is a runner-up trophy. They made it to the state championship, but were defeated in Buffalo that year. And he left a fair amount of written material from that time period, so you actually get a sense of the work that was involved. Yes, he was doing coursework, but this extracurricular was very important to him. He also, however, was this guy. This is him pulling weeds in Frewsburg, behind his boyhood home, a house that still stands. He looks about the right age, so I put this near the Jamestown High School year. His parents still live there. He commuted up to Jamestown, and he had to help out. And he remained connected to the real world in this tangible hand-down in the dirt way. And it never left him. Anyone from the Washington, D.C. area? Or spent time in Northern Virginia? Anybody know modern-day McLean, Virginia? You don't really recognize it here, do you? But in 1941, the Jacksons bought a 6-acre farm in McLean because they wanted a rural setting, and Jackson now had a lifetime job in Washington. It's called Hickory Hill, and they lived there for the rest of his life, and then his widow sold it to Jack Kennedy, and Jack and Jackie sold it to Bobby Kennedy, and gradually McLean grew in, so it's now a McMansion-filled, beautiful, but not rural area. And that is a Supreme Court justice on his knees working in his victory garden in the summer of 1943. Reaching high and ascending professionally, but remaining connected to a whole range of people and experiences is part of what forms this man. This is a very important influence on Jackson. Frank Mott, you can almost tell, was a devilish character. He was a distant cousin by marriage, late in life, of his widowed mother, to a distant relative of Jackson's mother. So they were tangentially in-laws, but Jackson's father did not think much of Frank Mott. Jackson's mother thought he was okay because Mott was always nice to his mother. And Frank Mott was a lawyer. Frank Mott was a Democratic political. Frank Mott was an orator. Frank Mott was a wheeler dealer. And Frank Mott was a great charismatic figure who captured the imagination of Jackson and took him under his wing as an apprentice. After that Jamestown High School year, Frank Mott brings Jackson into the office for reading the law, age 18, age 19. Mott is partners with this fellow. And maybe I read too much into the photos, but a little devilish and a little mature or cerebral or restrained. That's what they were as a partnership. This guy was a great scholar, Benjamin Dean, a great reader, a careful writer, a professorial temperament. Frank Mott would make noise in courtrooms before juries and win big verdicts and live a big lifestyle and travel around doing political missions and run for statewide office and leave excitement but wreckage in his wake. Ben Dean would hunch over with his pen and carefully write briefs and read his Blackstone and tutor and work young Jackson. And both of these formative influences are part of the training. This is the principal of the Jamestown High School, Milton Fletcher. He served for decades in that position and took a shine to young Jackson when he spent his postgraduate year there, 1909, 1910, and pulled him out of regular classes and started to tutor him in specialties like economics. Jumping ahead, Robert Jackson in 1943 writes Wickard versus Filbert, a landmark Supreme Court opinion about the breadth of the Commerce Clause. It's a unanimous decision upholding a piece of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It's the homegrown wheat case, and farmer Filburn, who was fined for growing too much wheat, even though he was just feeding it to his family and his animals. And that case went to the Supreme Court. He said, you can't constitutionally, you Congress can't constitutionally regulate me at home for what I do and penalize me for just being myself in private. And Robert Jackson writes an incredibly astute, brilliantly correct, in economic circles, uncontested theoretical opinion from the unanimous court, saying, withholding demand from the market is economic activity just as much as taking products to sell in the market. Self-satisfying demand withdraws demand, and that leads to price collapse, and that affects what Congress has the power to regulate, the market of interstate commerce. It's sort of like not having health insurance, just deciding I'm going to be healthy. I'm never going to get sick. And if I do, I'll just show up in an emergency room, and then the rest of you will get stuck with that bill. It's inactivity, some might say. 5 Supreme Court justices, for instance. Smarter Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg writing for the 4 of them, would look at that and say, didn't you read Wickard versus Filburn? Don't you understand economics? Don't you understand that Wickard versus Filburn understands economics? She doesn't refer to this, but don't we see that Milton Fletcher taught Robert Jackson economics? And to his credit, Chief Justice Roberts, one of the 5 in the healthcare decision a year ago, does say, in his opinion, because Justice Ginsburg has just punched him to a bloody pulp in her dissent, okay, economists might say, in other words, every economist in the history of economics would say that supply and demand are both economic activities, whether created or withdrawn. But the framers of the Constitution were practical men, etc., etc. And then Roberts kind of goes off and avoids the point. In other words, he's saying the framers were too dumb when they wrote the Commerce Clause to understand economics, so they really only meant activity, not inactivity. I must say. And Robert Jackson learned that in Jamestown in 1910. But this is the hero of the formation story. Mary Rosina Willard, an English teacher, a spinster, if I may say so. This is a photo about 1875. So by the time she was Jackson's teacher, she was an older woman and lived with her sister in Jamestown. Her sister taught in middle school and Mary taught in high school. They both taught writing and literature courses. And Jackson answered a question early in the semester in her class with a reference to something that he had read, not assigned by a Frewsburg teacher, on his own, probably out of a public library. And she said, Robert Jackson, how do you know that? And he said, because I've read Alexander Pope. And she said, meet with me after class, please. And she probably asked where and how. And then she realized that she had something here that was special. So she did this, and he saved this piece of paper for the rest of his life. Reading course in English literature, recommended by Mary R. Willard, 1910, property of Robert H. Jackson. And it's a mimeographed 6-page list of great works in English literature. The top items, a little hard to read here, include Adkins, Aldrich, Browning, Bochum, Manning, Ravel, Burns, etc. And it wasn't just a list. It was a shared project that Mary Willard embarked on with Robert Jackson. Not in the class. The class was doing what the class was doing. After school, after hours, one-on-one tutorial. Where? After all, he lived down in Frewsburg. He commuted by trolley to Jamestown. In her living room. How do I have a picture of her living room? Because I took it a couple of weeks ago. It's a standing house in Jamestown. It's now a community development agency. And behind the chair is an old fireplace. And on the mantle of this fireplace is an old nameplate, Bohemia, which is what Mary and Vesta, her sister Willard, called their home. And in front of that fireplace, 100 years ago, into the wee hours of the evening, they read aloud. Usually it was a quartet. A 4th person joined young Jackson and the Willard sisters, and Jackson started to bunk in with them. And words and expression and beauty and learning was a fuse that was really lit out of that fireplace. I remember going. Jumped ahead to Nuremberg. Jackson's closing quotes beautifully from Richard III. That's his absolute final passage of his closing in July 1946. He didn't have the collected works of Shakespeare with him at Nuremberg. He had memorized at least pieces of Richard III, thanks to Mary Willard, and drew on that as a felicitous way to draw the principle of accountability to an eloquent close at Nuremberg. Let me show you some examples. This is an editorial cartoon, just to start us off. It's Chief Justice Hughes scolding Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, and young Jackson. You see him in short pants. And Chief Justice Hughes is saying, "You've got to stop kicking my dog around." The dog is named the Supreme Court. This is the anti-New Deal conservative court that Jackson was becoming a public voice against in 1935 and 1936. Jackson, here giving a famous speech at the American Political Science Association in December of 1937, was in the fray of his time. He went to the meaningful topics and, frankly, kind of took chances. Yes, he had his practice in Jamestown and so forth to fall back on. He had ambitions that, frankly, he could have charted a smooth path toward. He didn't chart that path. He engaged in the fights of his time. That's Jackson testifying. This is one of my most favorite pictures because he looked good in a light suit in the cavernous Senate room. This is him testifying on behalf of the Social Security Act, which he then defended in the Supreme Court and won its constitutionality in 1937. And this is the artist, the master artist, in his studio practicing his craft. I kind of collect these images, but you see, the blotter, and thus the fountain pen, including one in his hand. And you see him hard at work, a framed old print of an English barrister on the wall. That's a DOJ office, I think when he was Assistant Attorney General. Another, Jackson bent over his pad in writing. Another, Jackson with a great old telephone, that's during the Nuremberg year in his home, writing. And examples of the product that emerged. And I've got 3 different types to show you as I conclude. These are drafts of a May 1941 national broadcast radio speech that Jackson gave on I Am an American Day. And you see how even after the drafting had produced the large font reading copy typescript, he was a tinkerer and editor who kept working on his stuff. And thus he's X'd the whole paragraph and he's tightening up his wording. We have set aside this 3rd Sunday in May. We have set aside this day on which to inaugurate, etc., etc. It takes time to write less. You might have had a great teacher who told you that. Mary Willard told that to Robert Jackson. And he learned how to write less, which is to write better, which is the editing process. The underlining, we'll come down to the carrot. The underlining is his reading emphasis. He quite frequently spoke from these prepared texts on these formal radio occasions, and he would practice. I don't know if that was shading mirror, but he would practice and he would talk to himself, at least in his head, and he would highlight his punch points, the words to emphasize, the places to take his breaths, the breaks and the emphases. That's what's going on in this page. The carrot is a late insert. And is frankly a beautiful phrase for an Attorney General of the United States to write in May of 1941. Feel the historical moment. Let me repeat, for sake of emphasis, decent law-abiding aliens need not fear any general roundup. We know exactly whom we are picking up, breath, and why we are picking them up, breath. There is not and will not be any dragnet, emphasis, in which aliens who register, who have obeyed our laws, and who want to be good citizens may be caught. Law enforcement directed at criminals, not law enforcement directed at our fantasies and our fears and the others in our midst. At a time of really dramatic laws and registration requirements and potential roundups and calls for draconian activity. He's the chief law enforcement official. He's at a microphone. He's telling the country, this isn't who we are. This is how we are behaving, with restraint. And frankly, to be the recipient of that communication has to involve some process of being reassured and feeling a bit of trust, which probably enhances the feeling of being a good citizen. A second example. This might actually strum a chord for a few of you. This is Jackson in April 1947, Speaking at the United Jewish Appeal at the Waldorf Astoria. Yes, this is Jackson giving a UJA appeal speech. And it's a press release copy for release on delivery. And you see it has a couple of typos which he's caught, so this is for him to hand to somebody afterwards. Page 10, line 3, insert not. Usually an important thing to get right in a speech. He caught it, he notes it on page 10, and now he's handing it to somebody for publication to make sure this appears correctly in the paper. And you see another example of his reading copy, emphasis, and marking. The policy of American and Allied diplomacy, breadth, in dealing with Germany is a delicate one, breadth. It leaves a hope, breadth, of rebirth of the German military menace, breadth. It may drive Western Europe into the Soviet embrace, breadth, if it destroys hope of restoration of normal economic life for the German masses, underline. It may drive them into the Soviet embrace. In other words, this is a Cold War speech with hope. We've got forks in the road ahead. We have military occupation. There's not yet a future Germany. It could be of many different types. We can steer it, and we can feel hopeful of the German people being what we wish to be, what wish them to be rather than what we fear them to be. A third example. This is Jackson, August 8, 1947, Virginia Bar Association, Roanoke. Jackson did probably even more of this than the prepared speech reading scripts that I've shown you. This is rough notes for extemporaneous speech. Sometimes the press of his day job and the foolishly large number of speaking commitments he would take on meant that Jackson was on a train starting to get ready. Didn't have a script in his pocket. And so sometimes he would doodle. It's not the back of an envelope. It's a slip of loose leaf paper. But he makes, a couple of basic points, which is, of course, what any composition teacher would have taught anybody, and Mary Willard taught him. What are your 3 things that you're here to talk about? You're here to talk about the Virginia Bar Association. You're here to talk about Judge Parker, who is a judge of this jurisdiction and was a judge at Nuremberg. And you're here to talk about Nuremberg in history, now and as precedent. And then he spells it out. That's as close as we can get to the studio of the master. And so at that level, I apologize. I wish it was 1947. You would have heard him deliver the 4th of July address in the amphitheater here at Chautauqua. I wish it was any summer during his lifetime, because you would have bumped into him here on the grounds. If you got back here every summer. Usually without a gig, usually just to sort of be in Jamestown and in the region and in the community. I wish it was the modern age in which he lived, so that YouTube had bazillions of hours of him. I can't quite fill any of those wishes. But I can tell you that he's there for the learning and the grabbing. And millions of people around the world have come to appreciate that. It is there in the written record, the published opinions and the published speeches. It's there in the speaking, the audio that's available. It's there for your reading. roberthjackson.org, etc., etc. And so before we turn to some questions, I would like to play a 5-minute piece so you can actually hear the voice. It's 4 minutes and something, from Nuremberg. And I should say, the speed and the distortion is a bit of an issue. Too fuzzy? It gets better. Let me pause. This is his closing at Nuremberg in July of 1946.
The Constitution states at its close, things inherently unassailable, because it rests so heavily on German documents of unquestioned authenticity. But it was a week upon week of picking at this case by one after another, with its in this case has nothing to do with some of the arguments put forth by the defendants or their counsel. We have not previously, and we need not now, discuss the merits of all their obscure and heartless philosophy. We are not fighting them for the possession of obnoxious ideas. It is their right to refuse to renounce the Hebraic heritage in the civilization of which Germany was once a part. Nor is it our affair that they repudiated the Hellenic influence as well.
Because of the cavernous echo, I'll stop. But he's saying this was a fair trial. The defendants were permitted to have their say in a way that they never permitted to any of the people they persecuted. Their ideas were their right, evil ideas. They were allowed to reject the Hebraic tradition that was part of Germany's past, and the Hellenic tradition, and etc., etc. We didn't prosecute them for being ideologues or for having evil ideas. We prosecuted them for conduct, for what they took their ideas forward into action and perpetrated. And it goes on. I would welcome questions, but I would also note that it's just after 10 o'clock, so anybody who wishes to get on the move for Justice Ginsburg should, of course, do that. And I thank you very much for your attention.